Let me get a little sip of water and then we'll get going.
I found this controversial clip of Bishop Barron buried in the archives.
I've always found atheists of all stripes helpful, both spiritually and theologically.
What does he mean that atheists are theologically and spiritually helpful? Let's watch this clip together, and then afterwards I will simplify what he is saying from this complex lecture into examples.
The great English Dominican theologian Herbert McCabe, a favorite of mine, engaged a number of atheists in the course of his career as a public intellectual. Typically, he'd allow his interlocutor to make his opening statement, detailing precisely why he didn't believe in God. And McCabe would respond, "I completely agree with you." The Anglican New Testament scholar N.T. Wright tells of an encounter he had with a young undergraduate when Wright was chaplain at Oxford. The freshman said, "Chaplain, don't expect to see a lot of me. I just don't believe in God." Wright asked him what he meant by God, and upon hearing the young man's account, he responded, "I can assure you, I don't believe in that God either." Like McCabe and Wright, I've always found atheists of all stripes helpful, both spiritually and theologically, precisely in the measure that they clarify what the true God is not. They expose and implicitly undermine new forms of idolatry. One of the clearest in this regard is the father of modern atheism, namely Ludwig Feuerbach, who famously held that God is a projection of our idealized self-understanding, which is to say, a simulacrum of God made in the image of man, precisely what the Bible would have called an idol. The only thing particularly new about the new atheism is its nastiness. Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, whom Paul Griffiths, by the way, deliciously combined as Ditchkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, they're numerous disciples, and by the way, they're everywhere on the internet. So my internet ministry with people in their 20s and 30s, their disciples are very thick on the ground. They borrow many of the intellectual insights of Feuerbach, Marx, Freud, Sartre, and Nietzsche. What they've added is a dismissive contempt for religion and religious people. Whereas Nietzsche and Sartre gave the impression they were in a battle with a pretty serious opponent, Ditchkins and company imply they're exposing the delusions of an idiot child. Nevertheless, they serve for our generation their essentially prophetic function of displaying idolatry. And this is continually needed since, as St. John of the Cross once said, the mind is an idol-making machine. There's so much we could say about the ruminations of the new atheists, so many ways we could engage them. Their obsession with biblical literalism, their deep concern about religion in relation to violence, their conviction that religion is irreconcilable with modern science, their conviction that faith poisons the minds of the young. Famously, they claim that religion is a form of child abuse. What I want to draw attention to, though, is one theme I take to be basic, one misunderstanding that conditions everything else they discuss, namely the view that God is a being among many, one cause amidst the range of contingent causes, a reality in the world whose existence or non-existence can be determined through rational, for them, scientific investigation. Christopher Hitchens, for example, delights in recounting the famous tale of the encounter between the Emperor Napoleon and the French scientist Pierre-Simon de Laplace, the author of Celestial Mechanics. Having heard Laplace's exposition on the movement of the planets within the solar system, Napoleon reportedly asked why the figure of God did not appear in Laplace's schema, to which the scientist laconically responded, "Je n'ai pas besoin de cette hypothèse." I have no need of that hypothesis. The assumption of both Napoleon and Laplace was, apparently, that God is rightly understood as one of the mechanical causes that contributes to the motion of the planets. Perhaps the largest and most important cause, but still one among many. Though Napoleon seemed to favor the existence of such a cause and Laplace to deny it, both thought of God as fundamentally like other worldly agents. We find something very similar in Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion. Dismissing Stephen Jay Gould's position that religion and science deal with qualitatively different dimensions of reality, hence the NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria, Dawkins opines that science can and must adjudicate the question of God's existence. He says, turning certain cosmological questions that seem to pass beyond the province of the sciences over to the chaplain makes as much sense as, quote, turning them over to the chef or the gardener. Here's how Dawkins characterizes the religious position, and listen carefully to how he lays it out. Quote, the God hypothesis suggests that the reality we inhabit also contains a supernatural agent who designed the universe and even intervenes in it with miracles. That's a direct quote now from Dawkins. And this is precisely why he can compare belief in God to belief in the flying spaghetti monster. Have you heard that phrase? It's everywhere on the internet. In fact, you can see it on people's cars now. People have the little fish that they're Christians, and people put feet on the fish. They're for Darwin. Now they have the flying spaghetti monster on the car. Now, why does he say it? It's a fantastical imaginary being for whom there's not a trace of physical evidence, and therefore the claim is made like God. And here Dawkins simply mimics his master Bertrand Russell, who famously speculated that it's as impossible to prove the non-existence of God as to demonstrate the non-existence of a china teapot orbiting the sun between Earth and Mars. That's Bertrand Russell's example. What's so telling about both analogies, again, is that God is being compared to some agent or entity within the universe and operating alongside of other agents and entities. Dawkins concludes on the basis of this understanding of the divine that God's non-existence can be demonstrated to a very high degree of probability. If Occam's great principle holds, then God is not required, since we can explain most, if not all, worldly phenomena by appealing to worldly causes. Je n'ai pas besoin de cette hypothèse. Who needs the hypothesis of God when things can be explained naturalistically? This way of approaching God is on particularly clear display in the manner in which the new atheists assess the traditional arguments for God's existence that had such an impact on me when I was a young man. Both Hitchens and Dawkins dismissed Thomas Aquinas' arguments in favor of first mover or uncaused cause with the cavalier question, well then what caused God? The observation proves, of course, that neither thinker has grasped the nettle of the argument, but for our present purposes, it shows that both persist in thinking of God as one more cause in a chain of contingent causes. We see it as well in their preoccupation, and their disciples, every day I hear this on the internet, their preoccupation with, quote, the God of the gaps. All the new atheists revel in what they take to be religion's instinctive but pathetic retreat into the gaps in present-day scientific accounts of reality. With some justification, they characterize intelligent design theory as just this sort of illegitimate move, because we can't discern a clear and uninterrupted path by which certain living forms today evolve from lower forms. We assert that God did it. But what will happen to God so construed as the fossil gap closes, or as our imaginations enable us to picture the evolutionary process more exactly? Dawkins laments the fact that while scientists try to clear up mystification, theologians seem to exult in it, playing temporarily in the darkness that science will eventually illumine. Once more, please, God is being thought of as a competing cause, ontologically at the same level as conventional, empirically verifiable causes. Now, the new atheists are far from reluctant to extrapolate from this metaphysical conception to what they take to be deeply disturbing implications for human flourishing. Representing as they do a supreme being, competitive with other causes, and brooding over the human project, the religions, they claim, foster a, quote, police state in which all aspects of the private and public life must be submitted to a permanent higher supervision. That's from Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. This God, I'll put it in quotes, watches and governs the world from the outside and imposes his rules on a recalcitrant human freedom. Hitchens seems to accept Sartre's famous syllogism to the effect that if God exists, I can't be free. But I am free, therefore God does not exist. Perfectly valid, the logic of that, by the way, but look at the assumption that undergirds it. This explains, Hitchens believes, why religion and political totalitarianism are usually closely allied. You find that argument again and again in the new atheists. Now, that's their position. I maintain that the exertions of the new atheists in regard to God are, for the most part, an exercise in knocking down a not very impressive straw God. a God who dwells in or alongside the cosmos, whose existence or non-existence could be determined through scientific investigation, who might himself be susceptible of causal influence, who bears even the slightest resemblance to a flying spaghetti monster, and who presides over the human project in the manner of Kim Jong-il presiding over Korea, is simply an idol of the worst type. And it's Thomas Aquinas, the great patron of this university, that helps us to see it. One of the most remarkable features, as you know, of Thomas's doctrine of God is its agnosticism. In the prologue to question 3 in the first part of the Summa Theologiae, which deals with the divine simplicity, Thomas famously comments, I'm quoting, "Since we are not able to know what God is, only what God is not, we are not able to consider in regard to God how he is, but rather how he is not." That sheds light in every direction when it comes to reading Thomas. Though we say many things about God, we're not entirely sure what we mean when we say them. The Fourth Council of the Lateran taught that in regard to our speech concerning God, in tanta similitudine maior dissimilitudo, in however great a similitude, there's an ever greater dissimilitude. Thomas picked up on this in making his distinction between the res significata and the modus significandi, the thing signified and the manner of signifying. And this is why Thomas consistently prefers the negative path when speaking of God, taking away from the concept of God whatever belongs to creatureliness. Though, for instance, we can speak positively enough of God's goodness, we don't really know what we mean when we use the term. To say that God is eternal is tantamount to saying he's not in time. To say he's immutable is tantamount to saying he doesn't change in the creaturely manner. To say he's a spirit is to say he's not marked by matter. But what any of these terms signal positively remains quite mysterious. What precisely does it mean to be outside of time? I challenge you to tell me that positively. No one here below can possibly know. What precisely is it like not to be material? No one whose mind and senses are ordered to the realm of physical things can ever really grasp. The parables of Jesus can be read under this rubric. We say quite correctly that God is just, but in light of the parable of the vineyard owner who pays the same wage to those whom he hired at different times of the day, we find our conventional view of justice confounded. We say quite correctly that God is compassionate, but in light of the parable of the prodigal son, we realize the inadequacy of even our most generous interpretation of compassion. If we press the question, wondering precisely why the God of the Bible remains so mysterious, so resistant to description and nomination, think of the scripture, "Truly, O God of Israel, you are a hidden God." The answer lies in the opening line of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Because God brought the whole of the finite universe into existence, God cannot be ingredient within the universe. He must be other in a way that transcends any and all modes of otherness discoverable within creation. Spatial distance, modal diversity, differences in grade, degree, kind, species, variations in speed, temperature, modal diversity, none of these can begin to indicate the radicality of the difference that obtains between God and anything that God has made. In Catherine Tanner's language, God is not simply other, he's, quote, otherly other. To put it still another way, God's transcendence must be construed in such a manner that it precludes the possibility of contrast in the ordinary acceptation of the term. Nicholas of Cusa caught this when he commented that God, though radically not the world, still must be seen as the non-aliud, the non-other. And this is why Thomas Aquinas typically refers to God, not as en summum, that means the highest being, but rather as ipsum esse subsistens, the subsistent act of to be itself. God's an infinitive, esse, not ens, not a noun. If God were the highest being, then he could in principle be categorized alongside of other beings. Ipsum esse, however, is not the most powerful and impressive instance of the genus being. In fact, Thomas specifies that God cannot be placed in any genus, even the genus of being. He is, but not in the manner that creatures are, just the contrary. Creatures are analogs of God's essentially mysterious modality of existence. The technical term that Aquinas typically uses to signal this unique quality of the divine manner of being is simplicitas, simplicity. By this he means that in God there's no distinction between essence and existence, a distinction which perforce obtains in anything that God has made. To be a desk is to be a kind of being, namely that which is constrained by the essential properties of deskness. To be human is to be precisely a human being, an existent delimited by the form or essence of humanity. In both cases, I'm using Thomas's language here, the act of being, the actus essendi, is, as it were, poured into the receptacle of a particularizing essence. And hence the things in question are, to that degree, metaphysically complex. But in God, the source of finite existence itself, there is no such distinction. Hence, God is not this kind of being rather than that. He's not in this category rather than that one. He's not great rather than small. He can't be placed, positioned, or indicated. In the strictest sense of the term, and Thomas insists upon it, he can't be defined, since definition necessarily implies delimitation. As David Burrell, who taught for many years at Notre Dame, put it, to be God is to be to be.
So let's take a few examples to show what Bishop Barron is saying and how it works. First, think about how often atheists say something like this: I don't believe in some old man in the sky who watches everything that I do. That's a common image, isn't it? And to be honest, it's also a complete distortion. A god like that sounds more like a mythological character like Zeus than the God of the Bible or classical theism. Aquinas and many other theologians have made it clear that God isn't a being in the universe like a superpowered person floating around in the clouds. He's not one creature among many. Instead, God is being itself, the source and foundation of all that exists. So, when atheists reject the sky grandpa version of God, they're actually helping us discard a false idol, as Bishop Barron says, and return to a more faithful, philosophical, and biblical picture of who God is. Another common objection you'll hear is moral in nature. How can you believe in a God who sends people to hell just for not being a Christian? That's a powerful challenge when you think about it. But once again, it's largely a rejection of a misrepresentation. The God revealed in the scriptures and developed in Christian teaching isn't some pretty rule enforcer looking to punish people for being born in the wrong place or believing the wrong things. The church teaches that God's mercy and justice are perfect, that he desires all people to be saved, and that individuals are judged based on what they truly know and how they respond to the light available to them. So, when an atheist objects to a narrow, overly simplistic view of divine judgment, they're not attacking the real God, they're rejecting a distortion. And in doing so, they push Christians to articulate a fuller, more accurate theology, which is why I think Bishop Barron is saying that atheists, although they are wrong about God, are actually theologically and spiritually helpful.